Welcome to Illuminated by Morehouse, a conversation series through which the college brings the discourse from its hallowed halls to the digital world to spark intellectual conversations, challenge perspectives, and make an impact. Today, we will discuss American history, its omissions, and how to recount the truth of America's past more accurately using mediums such as photography, fashion, architecture, film, and more. I'm Karcheik Sims-Alvarado, Assistant Professor of African American Studies and Director of Public History at Morehouse, and I'll let our other panelists introduce themselves.
Hello, I'm Clarissa Myrick-Harris. I am the chair of the Humanities Division at Morehouse College and Professor of Africana Studies. I'm also the convener of the committee to commemorate the Atlanta Student Movement and Morehouse lead for the Morehouse College Points of Light Partnership, Listen, Learn, Act to End Racism.
Hello, my name is David Wall-Rice. I'm a graduate of Morehouse College, class of 1995. I am a professor in the Department of Psychology here at Morehouse, and I'm over a lab called the Identity, Art, and Democracy Lab, and I also am executive director of Crown Forum in Integrated Learning.
Well, thank you all for joining me on this program.
Yeah.
It's so wonderful to have a conversation with you all. I know you both individually, we work as colleagues, but it's wonderful that we can actually come together to have a conversation about the gaps in American history. One of the things I find when my students come to Morehouse is their lack of knowledge about American history. And one of the things I enjoy about teaching is actually filling in those gaps. And I wonder for you all, what is your experience with students when they come to you and they share what it is that they know? What is your reaction to that about their level of knowledge about American history? Are there gaps, and where do the gaps exist? And either one of you all.
Well, I'll start. That's a very good question, and you find a range. There are some students who come to the classroom and they are ready, they know our history, but generally it's because they have parents who are aware and have consciousness and very intentionally talk about African American history and African history and beyond. And so they are engaged and they're happy to be in that environment. On the other end of the spectrum, we have students, I've had students to come in knowing very, very little. They know nothing beyond, the usual characters in terms of the story of Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King Jr., and a few others, maybe Malcolm X. But aside from knowing about iconic characters in our history, they know nothing of the true stories, the context, on a deep level. And so when they start hearing that history, there's a range of reactions. And I think there's been even a scholar, researcher who has talked about this kind of series. It's almost like the stages of grief. And so they go through, initially, when you tell them something that's really profound, something they had no idea of in terms of, for instance, the role of people, black people in the basic founding of the country, creating of the infrastructure, specific organizations, inventions, and so on and so on. Initially, there's almost disbelief. No, I didn't learn that. That's not true. Disbelief. Then they read, and nowadays in the times of Google, you go to reliable sources. They know the reliable sources now, and they'll Google. They'll look at original documents, primary sources that either I or they find themselves in terms of how they get to them, and there's this amazement and awe, and then they go to a stage of anger many times. Why didn't I hear about this before? Why is this the first time I'm learning about our history? And then after that period of anger, there is this pride and a determination to tell the story themselves and to make sure that they know more. And there's this eagerness, this hunger for more knowledge. That's been my experience.
Yeah, I echo that. That sounds familiar with how it is that I experience students, that are coming to Morehouse that we engage. It can run a spectrum. Folks who are very, very well informed, and then students who aren't so well informed. The thing that we know is that it falls in line with these master narratives of race, right? Within popular culture and popular tropes. And we oftentimes ascribe to them unknowingly, right? So let's say that we do know who Malcolm X is because he is so iconic. We don't know the folks who lifted him up. We don't necessarily know his story. But I think that, folks like, of course, Spike Lee, who made the film, help to fill in the gaps to some extent. But of course, it's our responsibility to ensure that there is nuance and depth to the stories that are about us and that include us. And this idea of contextualizing the stories too, linking them one to another. So, for example, I'll follow this line of thought around Malcolm X. A lot of folks don't know how it is that he is related or connected to Marcus Garvey and his father being a Garveyite, and looking at how that's a natural progression, right? And then looking at how Malcolm X's work informs the Black Panther movement. And so I think that filling in the gaps is so necessary. And, we do kind of person's work in engaging these young people. And then we get an education ourselves, in ensuring that we're able to be contemporary. But, the gaps in knowledge are, it really falls in line with the elegance and the thoroughness of white supremacy and racism, right? Is you don't even know what you don't know. And kind of to your point, this idea, wait a second, that we didn't do that. Yeah. Are you kidding? And I know that personally, a couple of years ago, right before COVID hit, the summer before COVID hit, I had the opportunity, and I wanted to do this all my life, is travel to Egypt. And being able to be there, and I went with, it was Asa Hilliard's revamped program. So I went with some folks from Howard University, Greg Carr, who's over Africana Studies there, kind of led the trip, and being able to be with him and Sam Livingston and kind of teaching students and being there. It gave me a sense of how those master narratives even reduce the most well-educated or exposed person, because you see these quite literal huge monuments that have your face on them, right? And it's not just one or two, it's the thoroughness of what it is that civilization, that democracy looked like in those times. And so it becomes our responsibility to kind of deconstruct those narratives that have so much to do with race, so much to do with hegemony, so much to do with white supremacy, and really connect ourselves and our students in ways that allow them to understand what their full potential is, but also what it was.
Yes.
I actually wanted to go on that trip.
Yeah. You got to come on. Now, we're going to do another one. We're doing
Let me
another
know.
one. No, we're writing up this stuff right now.
Exactly.
Great,
Oh, absolutely.
I'll be
So
there.
that brings me to this point, and Dr. Myrick-Harris, I know you can speak on this, but I'm gonna direct it to David Rice first, because I want to touch on what you just built on, and looking at the pyramids as a physical, tangible reminder of African American achievement. So here you have this structure that is literally it's the concrete proof that a thing existed, that Black people built. And seeing it, whether in Egypt or any place, Dr. Rice, is how does this change, how is it that seeing something tangible, a physical structure, shapes the consciousness of a person who's learning about history and learning about oneself?
Such a really, really good question.
Yeah, psychologists actually understand.
It's experiential. So having something that's tangible, right, is something that's right in front of you. It shifts paradigms in ways that we talk about wanting to, psychologically shift paradigms. Having conversations is important. Conversations is a part of psychology, right? You think and you process and then you eventually do. There is kind of this punctuated equilibrium, this ability to have folks jump levels in terms of how it is that they understand things differently by exposing themselves, right, to experiences that they heretofore haven't had. So for me, and this was what was super interesting about that trip to Egypt, was my mother had gone before, and I said, Ma, I'm going to see the pyramids like on the first day we're there. I said, I can go home after that. She was like, yeah. She's like, that's not even the most amazing stuff. I was like, get out of here, right? Get out of here, because you read about the pyramids, that's amazing. But then you see all of these other monuments, and the thing is, Mario Stevens was the brother who's there, who knows hieroglyphs, and he was pointing at hieroglyphs and explaining them to us as if he were reading the morning paper. And he was saying, that some people might say this, but what actually is happening is this is happening. So being there, looking at language, looking at how things were situated, looking at how nature was triangulated and integrated into lived experiences of the everyday. It was just so amazing. So the thing is that having the experience of something, being there, has so much to do with how it is that individuals are able to learn effectively and attach themselves to a thing. That's why we hear about having young students having teachers who look like them is so very important, because they see themselves in it, they experience it. You have these genius minds that are working with young genius minds, and it's like, I'm you. And it's not just telling them that, they're able to say, oh, absolutely, because I see myself in you. Such a good question.
Yes. And the other aspect of that is that still, even though today there's proof, scientific proof, that the people of Egypt, the Kemetic people, were people of African descent and were visibly African people. You see that when you go to the pyramids, and you see that in that entire area whenever you go, and I'm looking forward to going on the next trip. But now, even now, what students learn, what children learn, what adults learn about Egypt is still a white version of Egypt. You look at the movies, what was the one with Brandon Fraser, The Mummy, and generally they may have someone who may be a person of color, but it's not necessarily clear, but still there are those who argue that ancient Egypt was not a black society. That's still out there. And so first of all, exposing in the classroom our children to the knowledge that Egypt is in Africa. It is an African country, and the people there are of African descent. And then being able to take them to go yourself, and I'm so looking forward to that, but going and experiencing that. How do you refute several thousand years of evidence? And so that's a profound effect. It's transformational. You have that experience. Yes.
When I decided to become a historian, it didn't happen early on in my life. I always tell everyone I'm a historian, but I'm an artist first. And my mother is an artist. And I remember seeing her at an early age of probably like 2 or 3. She was creating murals in the house with a sponge hair roller. And for me, like, art became like the first words or first way of communicating. And so I saw her like creating these murals in the house, like she was creating a museum. So for me, and I learned how to read at a very early age, but before I learned to read words, I began to learn how to tell a story visually. And I saw her creating it right before my eyes. So for me, art has always been a very powerful medium. It's been a very powerful medium for me to be able to tell history. So just like with buildings have a way of telling history, and you know this from focusing on preservation, that it can raise one's consciousness. And the same thing can happen with art and photography, that they work in the exact same way, or maybe in a different way than with words, because words are just words on the paper. How do you humanize this person whose name that you see? Which brings me to this point about photography and how photography serves as a very important medium in raising one's consciousness and educating a person. The very first, I came to fall in love with history because I saw a photograph of an enslaved person, Delia and Renty Taylor. It's the first time I actually saw a photograph of an enslaved person. And the photograph was actually taken by an anthropologist at Harvard. And these photographs were hidden in the attic in the Natural Science Museum, where they have animals and species at, right? And it was revealed. And I remember looking at the subject in the photograph and what they were communicating with their eyes. They were both crying. And I'm gonna come back to that photograph when we start talking about the Ralph Lauren collection. But I saw I saw Frederick Douglass. And I saw how he used the power of the lens to look into it to communicate something. I had no idea that he was a formerly enslaved man. So I had these two images of a person enslaved, and then a person who is who's free. And he's communicating so much with the lens, with what he's putting on his body, with the way that he combed his hair. I didn't see an enslaved man. I saw a free man. I saw a free black man is what I saw. So I want to get into talking about how we can use these unorthodox means of teaching beyond just writing in the way in which we create scholarship.
Well, you mentioned Du Bois, even though you meant to
Yes.
mention Frederick Douglass, but
Yes, and I'm
that
going to
was
get to
not
him.
but
Yes.
that was not a mistake. Because I think about the 1900 Paris Exposition. Okay, W.E.B. Du Bois was at that time a professor here in Atlanta at Atlanta University. And that Paris Exposition, it was a global exposition. People from all over the world were there. His project was to focus on African Americans, 1900, how many years? 30 years, 35 years after enslavement, to give the world a sense of who these people were, who we were at that point in time. And so he had these wonderful, wonderful images, photographs of black people, men, women, children, in beautiful attire, beautifully posed, their homes where they lived. And then accompanying that, he had actual data, statistics that he had gathered through his, the Atlanta University conferences that he did in conjunction with other professors, other scholars in the Atlanta University Center, talking about, he did a wonderful job of juxtaposing this information. He gave the facts about conditions for African Americans in this country, the dire conditions, the health disparities, all that, but at the same time, he showed how African Americans have been able to transcend, in some cases overcome, and ultimately to protest all that was going on in terms of segregated society, health disparities, segregation, because the images that we see of people, African Americans in 1900, they are regal, they are proud. There's a sense of agency. And the one picture of Du Bois from that exposition, he's standing in a doorway. Now, keep in mind, he and his students took a great deal of time and care to prepare these charts. There was no internet, no computers. They did all this by hand, created these charts and graphs to show, to illustrate the information that he wanted to convey. The photographs were done, and I don't know the photographer. You might know the name of the photographer. Thank you. Yes, wonderful photographs. Assembled all this, packed it all up, shipped it over, but Du Bois had to sit in a segregated train to get to New York, to get the ship to take him over to France. But when he got there, there's this iconic image of him standing in a doorway, top hat,
Yes.
dressed, was that a morning suit?
Yes.
And looking elegant, looking proud, looking like the intellectual that he was. And so in spite of all of the slights and discrimination he had experienced just getting there, he asserted himself in terms of who he truly was. Yes. That's profound, the profundity of photography, of showing the visual images.
And Dr. Rice, I want to get to how these photographs, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with them. Yeah. They're these beautiful photographs, and so Du Bois he is bringing together this qualitative data and complementing it with photography, and he's challenging America's lie that Black people are inferior. So he has the data that he actually created with students from Atlanta University. And then you have these beautiful photographs where college students are at the center of this exhibition. How is it that seeing this exhibition or photographs like this raises, again, we're talking about consciousness, raises one's consciousness and change the thinking, not only of Black people, how they see themselves, but also how those who were not of African descent are seeing Black people. Do they say to themselves, we've been duped? And you see African Americans being portrayed so beautifully, you know, so I want you to respond to that.
Well, I think the if, again, following this Du Boisian arc, one of the things that he did was not only employ Eschew's photography, but I mean, he employed infographics, right? Before they were infographics.
Exactly.
So as you're talking about art, right, and how it is that you came to know a thing or to tell a story before you even really had a grasp of the language that you were employing, you know, he did that as well. So you have infographics, you have photography, you have the data, you have the narrative written out. So what you've done is you've addressed multiple levels and tiers and complexities of how it is that individuals take in knowledge, and not only take it in and are trained by it, right, but are educated through it. And so I think that so often when we look at, you know, if we look at the American educational system, you know, writ large, we understand that from the very beginning, it's a sorting mechanism, right? It's supposed to sort individuals into what types of, you know, career or field, maybe quite literally, you're supposed to go into. But what true education does is it engages the individual in such a way to where they see themselves within the spaces that they're being called to understand. And so what Du Bois was a master of in regard to that was engaging individuals on multiple levels, right? And when we're talking about, you know, oftentimes I did a qualitative research when I defended my dissertation. It was a first in psychology at Howard University at the time, right? So they made me go, anyway, that's another story, right? But in order to do that, I had to be super tight on stats. I actually was hired at Morehouse College to teach Statistics 3, right? Which people thought was hilarious because it was like, you're doing qualitative stuff though, but you had to be tight. And the idea is you have to be fit as a researcher to have the tools to answer the questions that are being asked. And there were so many questions that Du Bois was asking at the time that still persist today, right? But fundamentally, what's being explained, there is this position and this assumption, again, in this master narrative, that Black folk are less than. And what it is that Du Bois presents and what it is that comes out of the Niagara movement, what it is that comes out of institutions like Clark Atlanta, like Howard, like Spelman and Morehouse and Morris Brown, what comes out of that are multiple ways of articulating and understanding self first. That's why HBCUs are so important.
Yes.
So first of all is, okay, wait, we've been given this narrative that says that we're less than. And so, you know, you have professors like yourselves who come, and hopefully me, right, who come in here and say, let me dust you up, partner. This is who we really are. And now it becomes our responsibility to not only teach ourselves, but and I always say this, and I know that I trample over the quote, but in the words of Martin Luther King Jr., it now becomes your responsibility to go out and train and teach the sickened white man, right? Not in the sense of white people as being, you know, the devil or anything like that, but this idea and this understanding of what, again, hegemony and white supremacy is. Right. So how is it that you correct that big lie that we see is being perpetuated here in America in all types of ways? And we know January 6th and all that kind of jazz, right? But the thing is that there becomes a reckoning that people who have wielded white supremacy in certain ways have to be accountable for. And we're the consciousness for that, right? And so we have to make sure that as we're engaging our young people and our seasoned people as well, that we're able to do it on multiple levels. So we need to be able to be in discourse. We also need to be able to shake folks about the shoulders and say, look at this picture. Do you see who we are and where we came from? You need to be able to travel to the continent, not just to Egypt. Obviously, we want to go there, and I get you want to be there, right? Not just to Egypt, but also to Ghana, right? Also to Nigeria, also to Madagascar. I mean, it's a continent, right? So you want to go to all these different places that you're from so that you understand the resources that are there. that are still there, right? The natural resources, sources, and the human resources that are there, right? So when we're talking about civilization, when we're talking about coming to know who we are, it's important to know how complex and sophisticated we've been called to be and are able to be in the face of white supremacy and a structure that is built to grind us to dust. Because yet and still we've defied, right? And so often we talk about this construct of resilience. I actually am, intellectually, Du Bois is my great-grandfather, my mentor, who is 101 in June, right? Edmund W. Gordon is Du Bois's student. And one of the things that he taught me and in the psychology space was talking about resilience and how black folk are frequently thought of and understood as being resilient. And that's important and that exists. But so often, resilience is often stripped of the construct of agency. And so what we've done is what he's done is he's refigured what resilience is and talks about it in terms of defying. Because there's something that is learned. You push me, and I do this in my class, like I bring a student up and push them, and then push them, and they're like, and you push them again, and their muscle tenses up, and they stabilize themselves, or they begin to push back. What it is that you're learning from an experience so that you're able to be more fit and better adept at adapting to situation and contexts. So that's me going behind God's back to answer what it is that you've said in terms of how it is that we are called to and must understand multiple literacies. And that's something that we know that is important and that has been done for some time.
So let me bring together photography and fashion and the history of the entire Atlanta University Center, but in this case we're going to focus on Spelman and Morehouse, and then eventually with you we're going to bring it full circle with the Atlanta University Center. We have to talk about James Jeter and the wonderful fashion designer that just launched the Polo Ralph Lauren campaign. In looking at fashion, he pays an homage to young people who were pictured in school, the annuals, the yearbooks. And I learned just recently that Jeter was actually working as an editor for the Maroon Tigers. And for years, here he is, he's looking at these yearbooks, right? And he's writing about the Maroon Tigers, but he's reflecting back and looking at how beautiful we were, the way that we adorn our bodies, the way we prepared for class, the way that students prepared for chapel. So you see all these things being played out in his designs. And I'm going to come back to him in just a second, but I'm going to focus on photography and the Atlanta student movement, and then I want us to follow up in looking at Jeter's campaign and his tribute to Morehouse and Spelman. When we look at fashion and photography during the late 1950s, early to mid 1960s, you had students who were being photographed quite a bit during this time period because they were protesting. They had committed themselves to once and for all destroy Jim Crow, destroy its laws and its customs and traditions. And I want you to, Dr. Myrick-Harris, if you could speak to the Atlanta student movement, and then I want to talk about what we're seeing in these photographs that eventually Jeter would actually wind up looking at. So I'll let you do it.
Now the Ralph Lauren campaign, the Polo campaign, as I understand it, goes from like the 20s to the 50s. So it stopped short of the 60s. However, it must be known, must be said that even during the earlier period we're talking about, the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, the civil rights movement was going on. It wasn't what's called the modern day civil rights movement, but we talked about Du Bois, and the fact that he actually conceptualized the Niagara movement while he was a professor at Atlanta University, and that of course became morphed or was a precursor for the NAACP. Also, we have to understand that the 20s was the time of the New Negro. Okay, the New Negro, that was an assertion of African Americans, of their blackness during that time, self-determination. There was a time in which there were student protests at colleges and universities across the country, at HBCUs, that up until that time were being led by white presidents and boards of directors. And there were students who protested that. And that's when you began to see a shift in the complexion of the leadership of HBCUs, really even earlier than that. Here, for instance, at Morehouse, John Hope was the first black president. So we had that occurring even earlier, that shift in focus and leadership. So you have a period of time in which you have black people projecting their agency, their sense of self-determination, self-definition, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and then you have the Atlanta student movement. So it has to be understood that this is not something that just occurred, just happened overnight. They built on a history, on on the legacy of those who came before. Students at Morehouse, at Spelman, in particular, and led at this stage by Professor Howard Zinn, and then there were other professors that most people don't know that. A woman, French professor, Dr. Irene Dobbs Jackson, who was the mother of Maynard Jackson, actually was also an activist in her own quiet way. She was a part of the lawsuit against the city of Atlanta to desegregate the main branch, the headquarters of the Atlanta Public Library. And so she was like, she was the first, and Otis Moss Jr. was the second to get a library card from that institution, the main branch, the Carnegie branch. But there has to be this understanding that this was a legacy that was established over time. So that style and that grace you see in the students in terms of their attire, in terms of their the way they carried themselves, that was a part of that mentality, that thinking, and that dress, the way they presented themselves, that style was a form of protest. And it was a form of claiming and declaring and asserting their humanity. But what these students were able to do was to present themselves to the city of Atlanta and nationally and eventually the world as individuals who were not satisfied with the status quo. And one way that they showed who they were, their sense of agency, their sense of power, was by the way they dressed. And so they were instructed, when you go to protest, first of all, you got to be ready about the possibility of going to jail. So make sure you have a little bag with you. But second, they said, make sure you wear your best, wear your suit, wear your tie, wear your prettiest dress, your Sunday dress, wear your heels, and look like the educated, beautiful people that you are. And so when you see those images of young black men and women on those picket lines, in staging the sit-ins, in the marches, there is such pride. And I know the term that's been used about this period, not only about the Atlanta student movement, but more broadly in terms of the protests at Edmund Pettus Bridge and elsewhere across the South, this was a protest. They wanted to project respectability. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's much more than that. You're projecting dignity, you're asserting your humanity, and you're letting people know that you define yourselves after hundreds of years in this country of being called less than human. I'll stop there. I hope I'm answering your question.
No, you are. And I think that, when you think about the morning of the protest or the day of the protest, especially for the girls who, I want to call them girls, the women. I'm thinking about Dr. King actually referred to them as girls in a letter that he wrote to them, right? But on the day of the protest, you think about how do you prepare yourself for that day. You're going to be arrested. Your parents may get fired for you being arrested because you're going to be photographed. So people they open their eyes, their feet hit the floor, they get themselves cleaned up, and then they begin to adorn their body. And they're thinking about what they're going to put on. I had a chance to talk to Dr. C.T. Vivian, and I was looking at his photograph from when, his mugshot from when he was arrested during the Freedom Rides. And I said, I see you have your collar on right here in this photograph, but when you were in Selma, you never did have on your collar. And he said that was by design, that was intentional. He said, I wanted to intimidate those who were in law enforcement so that when I would go on television, and he said I had my hat and a had my suit on, but I left the collar, my minister collar, because I didn't want them to hesitate striking me. And they fell into my trap. And he said, and all of that was captured on film. So he said that if I had my collar on, then it would not present those of law enforcement as the aggressor. And he said, and when they're upset, that's when I do the teaching. That's when I go in. He says, where the love begins, you teach about nonviolence. Yeah. So he's very methodical about the way in which he was going to adorn his body. And I want to talk about Jeter and looking at photography and fashion and how clothing becomes a political statement. So when we look at students in those photographs that was taken by Thomas E. Askew, and then others who are going to become photographers for the school annuals for Spelman, Morehouse, and as well as Atlanta University, you see that the way that they are positioning those who are going to be photographed in a certain way. And there's a certain Black aesthetic that emerges, you know, when you're looking at the fashion of African Americans. You know, you and I all of us can have the same item, but we can do something different with it to make it stylish. And when we start talking about the Black aesthetic, it's the tilting of the hat, the way you rolled up your pants, the way you put your socks with those hands, you taper them and roll them up. That's style. I can put it on somebody else. It can be something totally different. But someone of African descent can look at you and say, oh, I get that. You know, that's the Black aesthetic. The way you decided to turn your hair to the side and twist it, you know, that's Black style. I'm gonna steal this quote from George E. Wolfe, the playwright. He said, first, God created Black people, then Black people created style.
All right. Yes, exactly. I love it. I love it.
Black people created style. I said, that's the truth. So when you look at these photographs taken by Thomas E. Askew and others afterwards, he's so intentional, Askew and others, they're so intentional about the way they position individuals. Yes. And those who are being photographed, they're intentional about the way that they dress their body to demonstrate that they have style. But if you look at those who are being photographed, you have students who are the children of tailors, shoemakers, seamstresses. I actually saw a figure that said that during the 20s and 30s and 40s, a large number of men worked as porters on the railroads, but there were a large number of women who worked as seamstresses. And so when you look at the academic system, the curriculum, home ec was taught quite a bit. And so women and men were taught how to sew. And sewing actually allowed for African Americans to be economically self-sufficient. They would serve as tailors, seamstresses, and their clients weren't just always African American, but also white as well too. Jefferson Long, the first Black congressman of Georgia, was a tailor. David Walker, who wrote the manifesto, I mean the appeal to the colored citizens of the world, a tailor. Frederick Douglass became free because his girlfriend at the time made him a sailor's uniform. And no one questioned it. It didn't look bootleg. So fashion has been so liberating for African Americans. And then when you fast forward and you look at the 50s and the 60s and what Jeter would eventually look at as he's thinking about what he's going to create in the future, here you have young women who are actually making their own clothes because due to segregation, they cannot shop in the stores.
That's right.
Or if they go there, they can't try clothes on.
They cannot try them on.
So many decide, well, we just won't go there.
Yeah.
And they make their own. So you're right, you have this tradition of African Americans showing that kind of agency that allows them, they become seamstresses, tailors, and they inject into that their own unique style.
Their own
You're
style.
Absolutely right. Yes.
So I want to come to, you served as a model for Ralph Lauren's act. Congratulations on that.
Yes, very stylish.
That's a strong term. I was
You
around.
are.
I was
You
hanging
can
around.
add model to your CV now. You know, maybe we change the graphics on today's program. Put professor, comma, model, fashion model. But you know, you and I, we were there together, and I was so moved by this one. And let me just go back for a bit, you know, for those who are watching. James, do you want to share with the audience who was responsible for this wonderful campaign that the world, even people on the probably outside of the universe, actually know about now? I'm gonna give you the pleasure of talking about the
You know, the
project.
thing I always want to say is I taught him so well, but I didn't know James when he was in school. But James Jeter is a 2013 graduate of Morehouse College. And had been connected to Ralph Lauren since he's 16 years old and working at the Ralph Lauren rugby store in Georgetown. So he was always interested with that aesthetic, right? And how it is that, you know, Ralph Lauren kind of pushed forward this American dream in the style that he developed. And so, you know, I've heard stories of him having, you know, when he first came into Morehouse and his peers were like, you don't understand, this dude was like, he had this black style that he had rocked with Polo when he first got on campus. So they were like, this is not a surprise to us who knew him. So fast forward to when I first met James, which was by email. He just reached out to me in October of 2021, and it was an evening where he said, look, I'm this creative designer at Polo. We have this idea that we're interested in, and I'd like you to talk to me about it if you wouldn't mind. And I was like, man, I'm busy, man. You know what I mean? I was like, I'm running Crown Forum, got thousands of kids talking about I can't graduate because I haven't gone to Crown Forum and stuff like that. But I did. I said, look, if you can call me right now, we can talk for 5 minutes before I put my kids to bed. And he called, and it turned into, you know, an hour-long conversation where I'm telling my boys, you better put yourself to bed because this is important stuff that's going on here. And it was just so amazing what it is that he revealed, which were these designs, these palettes, and these articles of clothing that he had guided me through, having looked through yearbooks, right? And the thing that I said to him at the time, you know, he could have asked me to jump right off the second floor of my home, and I damn sure would have thought about it, because the stuff was just so good, and I was so happy with what it is that he presented. He is a good person that was trying to figure out how is it that we can put this work out there, but not just have it be a piece of clothing. And his narrative and how it is that he came to do this is bound in George Floyd's murder, and how it is that he had worked at Ralph Lauren for some time and was having second thoughts about being there, and shared that with Ralph Lauren. And he said, I'm paraphrasing, but he's like, this is like super white. I've been here, I'm trying to figure out how it is that I fit, and it doesn't seem that I do. And to Ralph Lauren's credit, the question was, well, tell me what you have in mind. And, James was ready. And so he showed him, these ideas that he had, and, he was poured into and given free rein to run this fashion capsule that really is incredible, because of the different components of it. It's not just the photographs, right? There also is a book that's associated with it. There's a documentary that's associated with it. So what you've talked about in the very beginning, how is it that we realize and understand the importance of an education and realizing who we are as affixed to these important North Stars of articulating our humanity that we know from that time before and into the future. He's done that on really, really important levels, and it has brought people in, so where he could be very selfish and ruggedly individualistic about it, he opened up and said, who is it that could help me tell this story? And, it allowed people like you to be on board, for you to be here being in conversation, and for me to have a pretty pronounced role that I'm really honored to be affiliated with and to take responsibility.
So what was it like for you being on the set? I think for me, there was two very moving scenes. and one of them actually has to deal with you and the male models. There was one scene where the women were being filmed on Spelman's campus, and there were one older alumna. You see her in the salt and pepper hair, and she looked regal. And then we have a former Miss Maroon and White that was on set. And then we had students who were currently enrolled at Spelman. And then you had like about 2 or 3 professional models that were there. And we were in this space. I'm not sure if it was already set up or if it was staged or what, but it had, the wooden desk, all this beautiful brown furniture that was there. I'm not sure if it was that way when we got there or not, but here we were. You have a cross-generation of women associated with attending an HBCU, and the majority of them went to Spelman. And we were just talking about what it was like to be part of this tradition, even if you weren't, even if your grandmother or mother hadn't attended school. For me, I was first generation. But I knew that I belonged to this tradition, this history. And to be in that space and for us to have this conversation was just so moving. We weren't told to have the conversation. It just happened organically. And someone was filming it. We were just supposed to stand there and be pretty, right? And show off the clothes. But we began to have a conversation. It was just so moving that it happened organically like that. And then when we were on Spelman campus, I saw you, and I'm not sure if Dr. Henry Goodgame was there or not, but I saw you there with other students. And you were being instructed to stand on the steps, and I saw the whole image that I saw from either Thomas E. Askew's photograph or some other photographer years later. It all came to life before my eyes. And I saw Jeter's vision. I saw him performing like Askew. You stand here, you turn the hat a certain kind of way, you look here. It was like that famous 1906 photograph of the faculty of Atlanta University, right? Yes. Where they're all dressed up and they're all turning different ways. I saw that come to life like before my eyes. It was so moving. And I see him paying, homage to not only these designers that we'll never know, the tailors that we talked about, right? But I see him paying a tribute to also the photographers, and just the way, seeing you, it's like seeing someone from years ago. It was so moving for me, just in that moment, and so I want to talk about. I want you to share what was your experience like, being. I mean, you're really like you could have been the gatekeeper or the door opener, and you chose to be the door opener to allow for this full thing to come together and serve as an advocate for Jeter and say, we should take on this partnership. So I want you to talk about that.
Yeah, well, I'm moved now in hearing you talk about James so fully, and then you're in the documentary saying similar words, and I think it's so important. And as you're talking, I'm thinking of him as a conductor. And so hearing him, move to the side, and he actually said, this is the shot. Right, you heard him saying that. And then thinking about and getting to know him and really pouring through photographs and pulling together the yearbook, hearing him talk about, and there's a narrative portion in the yearbook where he says, growing up, there were pictures around our house of my mother and my aunts and the cotillions that they went to. And this was a form of beauty that I was exposed to in addition to an array of other beautiful moments, right, in the diaspora that I was engaged with. For me, the through line in the language that I reduce the entire experience to is just so happy to see him thrive and to see us thrive as the result of it, right? Because he's a special person. So in the moment, it's almost you don't have words for it. For me, I am a Morehouse College graduate. Graves Hall was the original building, after in Atlanta for all of Morehouse. So that was significant. Graves Hall was also my freshman dorm. So I was on the second floor, and I remember looking out on the quad and things like that. So to be in front of those steps was a huge deal. I also, while I was in college, there were these pamphlets that said Morehouse College, right? And there were guys who were lined up, and you'd see them. They were fraternity, or they were in the military, or they were just the every person who had a backpack on. And so to be in there with Graves Hall over your head, it was a lot. There were a lot of feelings, but it was just happy and proud and appreciative of the care that James took in being honest about what these institutions were to him, and that honesty permeated to me, right? And so I was just happy to be out there just looking around, quite honestly. So I wasn't in the gym where they were staging people. I just kind of walked out and was, ambling about and tripped up in probably way too many scenes. They're like, who is this dude? If you don't put him in there and he must be he's pressed. But, it was just amazing. I think for me, I think of that as part of the entire campaign and how thoughtfully it was engaged. So it wasn't a stunt. And for me, the clothes are cool and all that, right? But for me, the clothes as a tool in having a dialogue about who we are, who we were, and why these institutions and this history is so important to ensure that we have touch with. Because it really gives us a different type of compass, right? Yes. That contextualization is so important. Same way that I was talking about having gone to Egypt, the same way I felt when I, got off the airplane in Ghana and was in the market, and I was like, is that my cousin over there? I mean, you're like, wait, this is where I'm from. And so again, these spaces, these institutions, for a good part of us, this is where we're from. And certainly they are educational spaces and institutions where they are home to us, no matter if we went there or not. One of the things that was said about Morehouse before by one of our presidents was Morehouse College is not just for those who attend the institutions, it's for everybody else. So how do we open our doors at Morehouse, at Spelman, at Clark, at Morris Brown, at ITC, at Fisk, at Howard? How do we ensure that these doors are open? Well, a part of it is by exposing folks, having documentaries, having photographs, having clothing that is nodded to in some affirmative way, right? The way that Ralph Lauren did. And this isn't to be kind of an apologist or an explainer for him, for Ralph Lauren. But one of the things that I think is so important in this time where we have white folks talking about, I want to be anti-racist and all that kind of stuff, this is an example, I think, right? I think, unless somebody can disabuse me of this notion, but I think this is an example of a white man giving up his power, right? He gave his platform to James, and James knew what to do with it. And there were also brothers and sisters who were at Ralph Lauren as well, who were going to say, we're going to make this work. This thing is 2 years in the making, right? I just met the brother a few months ago and feel like he's a student of mine or a little brother or whatever, because of how it is that we're so bound to the truth telling that he's doing through this campaign.
And I have to, I didn't know if you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I think just to piggyback on what David was saying, this campaign opens a door. Okay, it is one campaign that starts, helps people to start thinking in a new direction. And you're right, in terms of Morehouse, Spelman, are, we know these very, some might say, elite institutions in the black community. They are the purview of college-educated people or people who are in the midst of getting an education. However, they are also institutions of the community. They were established really as a means of attaining social justice for all Black people, whether they come into the gates of Morehouse or Spelman or Clark AU at this time, or Morris Brown. Thank goodness Morris Brown is back as well, ITC, and then beyond the HBCUs across the South and across the country. But this campaign, it really helps people know this belongs to us. Mm-hmm. And it also, it can be conceived of as a first chapter, okay? This is what Mr. Jeter, this is his vision. This is how he sees this history. But our history is vast and deep. And so I hope it sparks the thinking of others to broaden, widen, continue to tell our story. So I'm excited about this and what it means in and of itself, but what it will mean, can mean, moving forward in the future, and connecting our institutions more overtly to the community.
And I
yes.
think that's so important. And James's design was that this was going to be the start of a conversation.
Yes.
What he said is he was excited to see what happened afterward. So
yes.
to see how it is that he's using his platform, his interests, right, to push forward these ideas and ideals of social justice and social impact is important. I would be remiss in saying this, and I haven't said it publicly before, but I know that I am in this conversation and talking about fashion and all that kind of stuff just because I was curious about a gentleman named Andre Leon Talley. So
yes.
Andre Leon Talley, who I really
yes.
thought of as a caricature, I was like, this guy is just over the top. I don't know, whatever. But I sat down and looked at his documentary
yes.
and then read his book, and I was like, this dude is about business.
Exactly.
And what I did after that was I figured out how it is that we could be in conversation with him for Crown Forum, right, which is our weekly chapel here at the college. He attended Abyssinia Baptist Church and loves Calvin Butts. And so Reverend Butts, I actually reached out to him. I was like, look, do you think this man will sit down and talk to me for a little bit? And he did. And we were in conversation for like 2.5 hours, talking about the importance of being a Black man, the importance of being a Black gay man who was breaking down all kinds of barriers and expectations of who he was supposed to be. Having gone to North Carolina Central, I think I'm right in saying that, and then went to Brown University, majored in French literature, spoke fluent French, was the Vogue fashion editor in Paris. I mean, thinking about all the things that this man had done, and also thinking about how it was that Morehouse in particular had never reached out to him before, and how it was such a gift to him that we reached out to him and had him in conversation. And the last thing he said before we finished talking for that interview was, please tell Dr. Butts that we had a good conversation. So how connected he was to his church, to his community, to his grandmother who raised him as well as his parents, but that lineage, that respect to Black culture, that conversation, I know is why James wanted me to be in the conversation about the line, right? And what he originally said was they were interested in having a small documentary. It'd be about 3 or 4 minutes to kind of tease about the collection. And he wanted to know if I would be in conversation and bring some folks together to be in conversation about it. And I said, look, I'm not going to do that because cultural appropriation, we've got to, I'm not, that's not my wheelhouse. I'm going to be asking you difficult questions. And what he said is, that's why we need to have faculty and folk there who are going to do that, who aren't just going along, but who can check me. And to pivot just a little bit, I know that within and across media spaces, there's great celebration for this, but there's also an important tension that exists where you have folks who are saying, no, this is cultural appropriation. This is just us performing for a white gaze. And I know my colleague and dear friend and brother, Greg Carr, who I referenced, right? He's somebody who pushed back, right? Significantly so. And he has to do that. He's supposed to do that. That's the role that he assumes in being at the position that he's in. I have to do the things that I'm doing in support of James Jeter, in support of what it is that we're doing at this institution. And it's important for us all to play these authentic roles of liberation and of freedom so that we're able to keep one another honest, right? And so Greg keeps me honest, right? I keep James honest. You keep me honest.
You keep her honest, she keeps me honest. And the idea is, how is it that we triangulate within our community in such a way that we're still uplifting and pushing toward freedom?
Yes.
Right? And we can have these public dialogues in agreements and disagreements, but they're all done with respect and with the mindset that, is this the best way for us to get free? So the work that James Jeter has done in bringing these images into a full consciousness in the public space that he was able to do, it has us not only thinking about those foundational questions that we talked about in the beginning of, are we worthwhile? Are we human enough, right? Of course we are, right? But what James is bringing into this popular space and this consciousness is, realize this, and then what are you going to do with it? You know, what do you do with it? So you know, I always employ two people, Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, who I love, right? And so Toni Morrison, in a famous interview, is asked how she feels about racism, right? And she said, that's the wrong question. Ask me what I feel about it. You know, how do you feel about it as a white person? Not you as the white person, but you who are practicing this racism. How do you feel about it? If you can only be tall when somebody else is on their knees, and then I stand out, what are you going to do? Do you still love yourself, right? Because you're strung out and there you are, just yourself. Are you any good? Do you love yourself? These are the questions that it's important for us to ask ourselves. That's all well and good. But these images of ourselves that put us within these popular spaces that are to be respected and understood, and our aesthetic that we put to it, well, that begs the question of the supremacist space within which we exist, where white folks have to begin to ask themselves questions. I belong. I mean, we built America, you know, figuratively and literally,
Yes.
right? So I don't have to, you know, I don't have to pretend to do any of this stuff. These clothes, yeah, I use that. It's a form of protest. And so is the fedora and the Adidas shell toes that Run DMC wore, right? So how is it that we manipulate and leverage these tools so that we are seen, so that we feel comfortable, so that we can do the work of being free?
I want to close out by looking at a statement that Ralph Lauren made with the release of the documentary. He talked about the American dream. His whole campaign is centered around the American dream. And for a long time, we didn't see ourselves as being part of the American dream, even within this fashion line that many African Americans support. And to your point, I have to applaud him for, instead of being the gatekeeper, to be the door opener and to create this possibility for James Jeter to present his fashion line and to present the Black aesthetic and to pay homage to those who went to Spelman and Morehouse. And so in looking at, you know, our conversation when we began and looking at the gaps in American history, that the story that James Jeter is telling through fashion, with photography, is that we're filling in the gaps. We're filling in the gaps because the experience of those who are part of this Atlanta University Center tradition, this history, we are filling in the gaps, except for it's not a dream. It's our American reality.
I like that.
Exactly.
So I want to thank you both for having this conversation. I hope we can do it again.
Yeah.
So thank you. Thank you both.
you.